Good morning and welcome. My name is Malik Stewart and I'm the Director of Multicultural Student Services at College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Thank you for joining us for this event as we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today's Lunch and Learn event features a presentation from Dr. Kurt Hollender titled W.E.B. Dubois in Berlin, German Letters and the Souls of Black Folk, and will last approximately 1 hour. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land we sit on today. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous peoples forcibly removed from this territory whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now, students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. I'd like to thank members of the MLK Planning Committee for their time, inspiration, and work in helping to plan this year's events. While the realities of COVID-19 forced us to change some of our plans, we're blessed to have technology that allows us to gather safely in this virtual environment as we recommit to the fight for justice and equality, both at home and abroad. I'm grateful for the audience members and taking the time to be in the community, as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. King. The theme for this year's MLK Week at St. Ben's and St. John's is the fierce urgency of now, a phrase Dr. King used in two prominent speeches, one being his famous I Have a Dream speech, and the other in the Beyond Vietnam sermon of April 1967. I encourage you all to seek out that sermon as it has important lessons for us today. A passage from the Beyond Vietnam sermon reads, "Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter, but beautiful, struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the sons of God, and our brothers wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of American life militate against their arrival as full men, and we send our deepest regrets? Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment to their cause, whatever the cost? The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history." Powerful words that I think are relevant today. Today, we will learn important history and context about W.E.B. Dubois, a prominent Black intellectual who was a major influence on Dr. King. I'm excited today to introduce our presenter, Dr. Kurt Hollender, a professor of German in our very own Languages and Cultures department at St. Ben's and St. John's. Dr. Hollender completed his PhD at New York University, and in 2019, he earned the Becoming Community Practitioner Certificate. The certificate recognizes Dr. Hollender's aim to strengthen the ongoing process of creating an inclusive community and a space for all to be heard and in which all can thrive. I encourage the audience to use the Q&A function for questions. If you just look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A. You can enter your questions there, and we'll be sure to save some time at the end for Dr. Hollender to respond. Without further ado, Dr. Kurt Hollender.
Hi, I'll just trying to share my screen. There we go. Hello, and thank you for attending my talk and for the kind introduction, Malik. My name is Dr. Kurt Hollender, and I do teach German here at CSBSJU. And along with my superb colleague, Dr. Brooke Kreidinger, we're the CSBSJU German section in the Department of Languages and Cultures. It's my pleasure to continue a Martin Luther King Jr. Day tradition in the CSBSJU German section by giving a public talk on to our campus community that draws out surprising connections between the German intellectual tradition and the legacy of civil rights in the United States as championed by MLK. This is the fourth talk that we've given in this tradition in the last 4 years, and it's my turn to give the talk this time. If we'd been together, you would have been hearing an introductory song as you entered the lecture hall, but I'm just going to play a few lines of this introductory song. It's from 1980. It's the music by Stevie Wonder to the song Happy Birthday. We'll just listen for a bit and I'll return to my talk. I hate to cut off Stevie Wonder. You get an idea of the song. You may have heard it. You probably heard it. Now, right above Stevie today is my title for the talk today. As you can see, that will be titled W.E.B. Du Bois's Time in Berlin, Germany, and the Influence of German Letters on Du Bois's famous The Souls of Black Folk from 1903. Now, we'll get to Du Bois and the topic of the day shortly, but the reason I'm starting with Stevie Wonder's tune is because it's a fitting beginning to our intervention today. And because Wonder's song sings happy birthday to Dr. King. January 17th, our MLK Day, is King's historical birthday. Wonder's addressee then in the song is Dr. King. Now, singing praise and marking the holiday as a celebration has a long tradition in poetry and thought, perhaps most famously in Friedrich Hölderlin's poem Wie wenn am Feiertage, or As on Holidays, written around 1800. And interpreted by Martin Heidegger to demonstrate that any holiday, defined as a day on which one does not work, gives meaning and rhythm to the more usual work day. A year of only work days or only holidays would be monotonous, and the mixture of two gives meaning to both. You could say that Hölderlin and Heidegger then have long given an answer to Elvis Presley's rhetorical question, why can't every day be like Christmas, from the 1965, if every day were like Christmas. I'm not going to sing that here. Well, maybe a little bit. Yeah, I think you know, why can't every day be like Christmas? You've heard it if you've been to a Walgreens in December in the United States. Well, Mr. Elvis, it can't be like Christmas every day because the holiday and work day mean differently. And MLK Day does mean differently. Here we are. We didn't work yesterday to celebrate MLK's Day. I'm telling a brief joke about Elvis, the King Presley, but more importantly, we're celebrating Dr. King's birthday with Stevie Wonder's song, Community, and German metaphysics. What is better than that? In what follows, I'll briefly contextualize the CSBSJU German MLK Day talks from the years past, and then I'll turn to our exciting topic of today, Du Bois's time in Berlin and its lasting influence on his work. This presentation aims to be generally informative with a few scholarly touches and close readings, and I aim to talk for about 35 minutes, followed by Q&A. We surely won't use the whole hour that's set aside, but if folks do want to stay around for Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions. And characteristically, if you know me, there'll be updates along the way about campus event information as well as professionalization opportunities related to our topic. Finally, Dr. Kreidinger and I are also happy to share our slides and text with you from our other talks or discuss those other talks should you become more interested in any of these topics. Just reach out. And finally, I'll take attendance on Zoom here for those folks seeking extra credit in German classes. Now, the slide above, there are the figures and titles that we'll be discussing today, and the figures are in chronological order. W.E.B. Du Bois, born 1868 to 1963, sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, American writer, editor, MLK Jr., 1929 to 1968, American Baptist minister, activist, leader in the American Civil Rights Movement. Audre Lorde was another figure that we've discussed in the past in this series, American writer, feminist, and civil rights activist, as well as Angela Davis, 1944 to the present, American political activist, philosopher, academic, and author. Those are some of the proper names that we've been discussing in years past. In 2019, we talked about the imagination in politics and aesthetics, from German idealism to Angela Davis. 2020, MLK's Surprise Berlin connections about German idealism and civil rights on both sides of the Atlantic and Berlin Wall. And in 2021, Audre Lorde is from a transnational perspective, cultivating connections in the Afro-German community and beyond. Today, it'll be W.E.B. Du Bois in Berlin. Back in 2019, we showed that Angela Davis is a leading contemporary advocate for the artist's role as educator in cultivating the audience member's imagination. And secondly, that she points out that by virtue of their mastery of the imagination, often are artists politically active because they can imagine not only new forms of art, but also new forms of political and societal organization. As a case in point, Stevie Wonder, our starting poet today, who used proceeds from Happy Birthday song to raise awareness for Dr. King's legacy and was pivotal in actually getting Martin Luther King Jr. Day installed as a national holiday. Case in point to Angela Davis's point about aesthetics and politics. So if you take a brief look at the text of the song, you'll notice that it actually, what you heard when you entered, actually advocates for the holiday that we're celebrating. Happy birthday lyrics. You know it doesn't make much sense. There ought to be a law against anyone who takes offense at a day in your celebration, because we all know in our minds that there ought to be a time that we can set aside to show how much we love you. From Hildeline all the way to Stevie Wonder, you see the thinking of the holiday by the poet. In 2020, I presented on the influence of German idealist philosophy, notably Kant and Hegel, on MLK's political and moral thought. For example, Kant's ethical influence on King is visible in the essay, The Ethical Demands of Integration, in which King quotes Kant on the second categorical imperative. Then in the second half of that talk, I focused on King's civil rights influence in West and East Germany, which he visited both sides of the wall in 1964. King was one of the few visitors who could actually negotiate both sides of a divided Berlin, and was hailed on both sides of the wall as a very interesting speaker to have. And his nonviolent stance may have partly inspired the nonviolent dissolution of East Germany in 1989. Dr. Kreidinger presented on Audre Lorde in 2021, poet and activist, and her influential time in Berlin in the 1980s and 1990s. She was an instructor there at the Free University of Berlin, and Lorde helped coin the term Afro-German at that point, and has had a demonstrable influence on Afro-German poet activists up to this day, including Mai Ayin. Berlin. All of these talks focus not only on civil rights in Germany, but specifically the city of Berlin. Angela Davis received her doctorate in philosophy from the Humboldt University in Berlin. King visited both sides of the wall, as I noted, and Audre Lorde too found something of a second home there. We're going to pivot to W.E.B. Du Bois's time at the Humboldt University in the late 1800s soon. But for the moment, let me note that we're developing an exchange program here at CSBSJU with this dynamic city. It's planned for the CD mod on campus, as well as then in Berlin in May of the spring term of 2023. So spring term next year, next spring term starting CD mod. And that will be led by me and Dr. Brooke Kreidinger if we're approved. I'll also just quickly note, we offer a lot of classes on interesting topics, on German topics in the English language, if you're interested in taking any of them. Right now, in spring 2022, we have German film and CSDI German Americans. Notice all of the integrations curriculum designations that we have for our classes. Fall 2022 will be Grimm's Fairy Tales, taught in English on that interesting German topic. Human Experience, Justice Encounter, Benedict and Raven, and an ethics course in the core curriculum. Okay. Du Bois, and why is he important for the history of civil rights in the United States? This is the Du Bois part of the talk. I'll be quoting and paraphrasing from Thomas Holt's biography from the University, Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. For the full biography, please consult their website. It's a great resource. Holt on Du Bois's general impact, quote, undoubtedly the most important modern African-American intellectual, Du Bois virtually invented modern African-American letters and gave form to the consciousness animating the work of practically all other modern African-American intellectuals to follow. He authored 17 books, including 5 novels, founded and edited 4 different journals, and pursued 2 full-time careers, scholar and political organizer. But more than that, he reshaped how the experience of American and African America could be understood. He made us know both the complexity of who Black Americans have been and are and why it matters. And he left Americans, Black and white, a legacy of intellectual tools, a language with which they might analyze their present and imagine their future. We're talking about a little bit about the urgency of now as our theme for MLK Day. And I'll add to that urgency that Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk is the 39th most assigned and read title at colleges in the contemporary United States, according to the Open Syllabus Project. It still resonates today and is still highly studied. Holt again. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868 and died in 1963. He was a scholar, writer, editor, civil rights pioneer, born William Edward Burghardt Du Bois in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, the son of Mary Sylviana Burghardt, a domestic worker, and Alfred Du Bois, a barber and itinerant laborer. Young Will Du Bois spent most of his childhood in that small western Massachusetts town where probably fewer than 2 of the 4,000 inhabitants were African American. He received a classical college preparatory education in Great Barrington's racially integrated high school, from whence in June 1884 he became the first African American graduate. A precocious youth, Du Bois not only excelled in his high school studies, but also contributed numerous articles to two regional newspapers, Springfield Republican and the Black-owned New York Globe. In 1888, Du Bois enrolled at Harvard as a junior. He received a BA cum laude in 1890, an MA in 1891, and a PhD in 1895. He is the first African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard University. Du Bois was strongly influenced by the new historical work of the German-trained Albert Bushnell-Hart and the philosophical lectures of William James while at Harvard. Both became friends and professional mentors for his life. Other intellectual influences came from his studies and travels between 1892 and 1894 in Germany, where he was enrolled in the Friedrich Wilhelm der Dritte Universität, then commonly referred to as the German University of Berlin, and renamed Humboldt University after World War II. Because of the expiration of the Slater Fund Fellowship that had supported his stay in Germany, Du Bois could not meet the residency requirements that would have enabled him to formally stand for a degree in economics, despite his completion of the required doctoral thesis on the history of Southern US agriculture during his tenure in Berlin. Returning to the United States in 1894, Du Bois taught classics and modern languages for 2 years at Wilberforce University in Ohio. He was a language professor, and he taught in Ohio. That's the state that I'm from. By the end of this year at Wilberforce, Du Bois had completed his Harvard doctoral thesis titled The Suppression of the African Slave Trade in the United States of America, 1638 to 1870, which was published in the 1896 as the inaugural volume of the Harvard Historical Studies series. Yet it was with the publication of The Souls of Black Folk in 1903 that Du Bois emerged as the most prominent spokesperson for the opposition to Booker T. Washington's policy of political conservatism and racial accommodation. Du Bois's theoretical break with Washington in The Souls of Black Folk insists on the right to vote, on civic equality, and for the equal education of the youth in this moving work, things we recognize from Dr. King's work as well. Du Bois's practical break with Washington happened decisively in 1904 when Du Bois joined William Monroe Trotter and other Washington opponents to form the Niagara Movement, an organization that advocated for full civil and political rights for African Americans. The Niagara Movement's aims were fully realized only with the foundation of the new biracial organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which remains active through today, and for which Du Bois is credited as being a co-founder. The NAACP grew out of the agitation of a 1909 conference called to protest the deteriorating status of and escalating violence against Black Americans. The NAACP launched legal suits, legislative lobbying, and propaganda campaigns that embodied uncompromising militant attacks on lynching, Jim Crow, and disenfranchisement. In 1910, Du Bois fully joined the NAACP as an officer and its only Black board member, and to edit its monthly magazine, The Crisis. After a career in academics at Wilberforce University of Pennsylvania, Atlanta University, writing, editing, and advocating for the rights of African Americans at the NAACP, Du Bois died in Ghana the day before the American compatriots, including MLK, assembled for the March on Washington the day before, or Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was a conjunction more than rich with historical symbolism. The life and works of Du Bois had anticipated the values embodied in the March on Washington. End quotes from Holt. So there you have who Du Bois was, his monumental work, both theoretical and practical, to better understand the United States, and the symbolic passing of the torch to Martin Luther King Jr. and his legacy of civil rights advocacy. King had high praise for Du Bois on many occasions. From this overview, let us now focus on that short but decisive time of Du Bois's education in Germany. And here in his own words, he reflects back, and I'm grateful for the digitization efforts of the University of Massachusetts Amherst Archive for some of the artifacts that I'll be sharing with you today. Germany by W.E.B. Du Bois. There are few places on earth for which I have greater affection than for what is now called East Germany. I saw it first in my young manhood. I was 24 and had come abroad on a scholarship to study. I made that unforgettable journey up the Rhine from Rotterdam to Köln, and then went east to the old duchy of Sachsen, Weimar, Eisenach. In Eisenach, I spent the summer with a German family. There was the Oberpfarrer Herr Dr. Marbach, his wife and two daughters, Dora and Ilse, and guests from South Germany, France, and England. It was an ideal group of young people with a typical German teacher and his housewife at the head. We visited the Wartburg of Luther almost daily. We walked in the forests and talked and sang. We saw the Weimar of Goethe and Schiller. And afterward, I made the Harzreise and saw Lübeck and the Hanse's cities. and went to Leipzig and Dresden and finally studied in Berlin. So here we have the personal insights of Dubois as an excited young study abroad student. To a contemporary German learner today and traveler in Germany, the sites he mentions warm one's heart with fond memories and touristic memories as well. He mentions Luther, Goethe, and Schiller, names the three largest naming therein the three largest influences on the modern German language. He visited the Wartburg Castle where Luther translated the Bible. He did the Harzreise, most famous hike in Germany amongst the Harz Mountains, went boating on the Rhine. It's as if you heard a rosy account of a student who had studied here in the United States, recalling their time seeing the Constitution firsthand in DC, hiking the Appalachian Trail, going to Times Square, taking a riverboat cruise on the Mississippi. It's that type of thing if you know these spots in Germany. Now here he is with some other Berlin students from that time. You notice him here. He saved everything. Here is his identification card from the University of Berlin when he was there. And here are some souvenirs from his trips down to Bavaria to see Wagner's operas in Wagner's own town and opera house of Bayreuth, arguably one of the greater opera pilgrimages in the Western world. He saw the Ring Cycle. Here's his ticket to see Lohengrin. Lohengrin is mentioned as well in the Souls of Black Folk. And here too is finally notes for a 1925 list of concert agencies in Germany for a possible tour of African Americans through Germany. He immersed himself in the literature, culture, and the classical music of Germany, which he never forgot. Now, as Hamilton Beck argues in his article, W.E.B. Du Bois, a study abroad student in Germany, in Frontiers, the interdisciplinary journal of study abroad, Du Bois was, quote, by Hamilton Beck, among the most prominent Americans to study abroad in the 19th century, end quote. And Dr. Hollender, I'll add that he really did study abroad the right way. Homestay, immersing himself in the language, immersing himself in the culture, researching, going to the best address he could to study, which is in Berlin. And as Beck writes, quote, at the time, the Friedrich Wilhelms Universität zu Berlin was the most modern in the world, with famous faculty including the philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey, the economist Gustav Schmoller, the historian Heinrich von Trietsche, professor of German literature Erich Schmidt, Max Weber, the very famous sociologist with whom Du Bois maintained contact throughout his life, the classical philologist and Nobel Prize winner Theodor Mommsen, and the physicists Hermann von Helmholtz and Nobel Prize winner Max Planck, and as well as the founder of modern pathology, Rudolf Virchow. So he really went there at a time when some of the greatest minds in Europe are organizing at this university. His intense studies, tireless traveling, and language learning demonstrated an incredible study and broad experience can do for an ambitious young American. And the impact of that stay can be seen in a major contribution to civil rights in American literature, The Souls of Black Folk. And here I'll turn to the more scholarly part of my talk. Let me quote Andrew Leiter's summary of The Souls of Black Folk in his University of North Carolina's Documenting the South project to give us an overview if you haven't yet read this 39th most read work at American colleges. Quote, W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk is a seminal work in African American literature and an American classic. In this work, Du Bois proposes that, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, end quote. His concepts of life beyond the veil of race and the resulting double consciousness, his sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, has become touchstones for thinking about race in America. In addition to these enduring concepts, Souls offers an assessment of the progress of the race, the obstacles of that progress, and the possibilities for future progress as the nation entered the 20th century. Against Booker T. Washington, Du Bois asserts that a policy of compromising on full rights has damaged African Americans by contributing to the loss of the vote, the loss of civil status, and the loss of aid for institutions of higher education. Du Bois insists that, quote, the right to vote, civic equality, and the education of youth according to ability, end quote, are essential for African American progress. That's end quote from Leiter's summary. Now, Du Bois's contribution to the concept of double consciousness that I mentioned above in the summary, and he's very famous for this work, double consciousness has been variously interpreted. Nasir Meyer and John Pittman have read it in relation to Hegel's dialectic of consciousness, and Pittman and Dickinson Bruce have also related it to Ralph Waldo Emerson's transcendentalism. Meyer, Pittman, Beck, Bruce, Du Bois biographer David Levering Lewis all mention in passing Du Bois's possible reference to the famous Two Souls quote from Goethe's Faust, his favorite author and one of the German authors who he visited, whose monuments he visited. But he does not. But none of these thinkers go into any detail about that point of the possible Faust reference in the title of the book. So going into detail will be a little bit more of my task today. Now, if we parse the differences between the concepts of spirit, consciousness, and soul, they're all different and they're all used by Dubois. That will be beyond the pale of the talk today. So let's just stick with the title of the Goethean Souls to mount our reading here and now. Dubois, as you recall, visited Goethe's hometown of Weimar with the Marbach family and knew and revered this greatest of German poets with his monumental drama of modernity, Faust. Now, Faust was written around 1800, but it tells the story of the historical German doctor from the 1500s, who, according to folk tellings, sold his soul to the devil for earthly knowledge. Well, not exactly the devil, a lower demon. Among the early figures of Don Juan, Hamlet, and Don Quixote, Faust figures, though, as the ceaselessly striving figure of modernity or early modernity and in Germany's contribution to world literature. Now, world literature itself, incidentally, is a concept and term first invented by Goethe around 1800 as well, a good 100 years before Dubois. Now, from one of our greatest living Germanists, Professor David Welber of the University of Chicago, he says of Faust, quote, Faust is an exploration of how human life unfolds when it emancipates itself from the ordinations of tradition and embarks on a project of energetic self-assertion and self-optimization, end quote. In short, Faust embodies modern subjectivity, unmoored from the ancient Aristotelian teleology, or in everyday speech, one's place in the universe, station in life, and end is no longer considered predetermined, but to be forged and self-asserted by the individual. That would be a teaching of Goethe's monumental Faust text, which is written around 1800. Now, more than a single striving, Faust's striving for Goethe is doubled. As Faust himself says, he has, now think of Dubois's title on Multiple Souls, quote, 1806 to Wagner, Faust, you only know, Faust is speaking to his student, Faust, you only know one driving force. You may never seek to know the other. Two souls, alas, reside within my breast, and each is eager for a separation. In throes of coarse desire, one grips the earth with all its senses, one soul, while the other struggles from the dust to rise to the higher ancestral spheres, soul number two. The Germanist Albrecht Schöne has pointed out that the twin souls reach back to at least Plato's allegory of the two-horse chariot and the Phaedrus, but Goethe updates them in Faust, and Dubois updates them again in the Souls of Black Folk. Faust strives for both book learning, we could say, as well as the knowledge of the earth or of earthly things, of both. Now let's read Dubois's title very closely. The Souls of Black Folk. Not the souls of Black folks, nor the soul of Black folk, but multiple souls and one folk. Two souls, like Goethe's Faust. In fact, a Goethe hint comes in the very first pages of Dubois's work when he writes in German. For Dubois, the age after emancipation is an age of Sturm und Drang, storm and stress. Quote, so dawned the time of Sturm und Drang. Storm and stress today rocks our little boat on the mad waters of the world sea. There is within and without the sound of conflict, the burning body rending of soul, inspiration strives with doubt, and faith with vain questioning, end quote from Dubois's text. So too does the first chapter of the Souls of Black Folk thematize striving, like Faust. The title, chapter title, chapter title is Of Our Spiritual Striving. Now let me turn to the famous quote on double consciousness from Of Our Spiritual Striving chapter in the Souls of Black Folk. And I'll point out that some terms here sound painfully dated to us today when we read this artifact from over 100 years old. Quote, the Negro is born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world, a world which yields to him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa, and will not bleach the Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows the Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible to be both Negro and an American, without being cursed and spat upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face, end quote. So here's Du Bois's redefining of those two souls. Again, it's painfully dated. The American Negro, for example, quote above, whose two souls represent not the twin strivings of book knowledge and earthly knowledge in Faust, but as an American and as a Negro, in Du Bois's words. Faust had also wished to separate his two striving two souls fruitlessly, but Du Bois aims for synthesis. Quote, quite simply wishes to make it possible to be both a Negro and an American, end quote. A harmonized fusion of the two souls is Du Bois's stated goal here in the text. And yet a Goethean sheen remains in the work. The titles multiple souls and the theme of striving that we find here can also be read in Du Bois's figuring. This attainment of a fused self-consciousness reminds one of a Faustian self-determined modern striving. We mentioned Du Bois's interest in classical music. We started with music, and now in the final minutes of my talk, we'll also end with music. Goethe has a contemporary and a teacher named Johann Gottfried Herder, who initiated the practice of finding the dignity of a people in their folk songs. And Herder even coined the term folk song. Herder is the first to collect such songs that demonstrate a national character, and that was followed by Armin and Brentano, and finally the fairy tale gathers Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, which after the Luther Bible, Grimm's Fairy Tales is still the second best-selling book in Germany and in German. Herder, Arnim, and others, their books can be found in many homes as well. So let's recall that Du Bois sang songs with the Marbach host family, and that Du Bois writes in the Striving chapter that, quote, there is no true American music but the wild, sweet melodies of the Negro slave. The American fairy tales and folklore are Indian and African, end quote. And he also mixes the sorrow songs, African-American folk songs, songs of the time of slavery, songs of suffering, songs of enslavement. Du Bois mixes these into his text as well. We started with that small quote about Sturm und Drang, the first German words that Du Bois writes in this text. There are more that we won't have time to cover. But the storm and stress period is both the time where Goethe begins writing and working on his Faust, as well as working with Herder, who is collecting these folk songs and finding dignity in them. So here is just a bit of the music. You can see how it's mixed into the Du Bois text of our Spiritual Strivings chapter. Starts with a quoted poem, and then he gives you some lines of music of one of the sorrow songs throughout. So today we refreshed our memories about previous CSBSGU German MLK Day talks on Angela Davis and aesthetics and politics and the imagination, the influence of German idealist philosophy on MLK Jr.'s thought, as well as his visits to both sides of the Berlin Wall in 1964, on Audre Lorde's influence on Afro-German writing and activism, and a quick reminder that Dr. Kreiding and I are happy to talk more about these topics with you, share slides, etc., if you just reach out. I'll remind you again about our exchange program coming to Berlin as well, and take a look at our English classes and the NAACP careers page you can find here from my slides, but you can also go to our website where I have hundreds and hundreds of ideas, things like this, where you can hear something from a talk and maybe go intern somewhere. So our main focus today was W.E.B. Du Bois's years studying abroad in Berlin in the late 1800s and the subsequent influence of Goethe and Herder on his monumental The Souls of Black Folk from 1903. Double consciousness, multiple souls, the striving of the modern subject. We also touched on Du Bois's love of classical music, including Wagner, and now we'll note Beethoven. This is Dubois's will and testament to his second wife. This is from 57. Dear Shirley, I have been meaning for years to set down some wishes about my funeral exercise, but it's a bit gruesome task, and I'm always feeling well enough to think that putting the matter off a bit won't hurt. But today I'm reminded that I must do at least this to ease our task when the end comes. Of course, I want the ceremony short and simple. I would prefer it not in a church. The music might be 2 or 3 Negro spirituals connected to the sorrow songs that we've heard, that we mentioned, and then Schiller's Ode to Joy, Beethoven's music, emphasis added. Don't stress religion or the immortality of Jesus Christ or the good God. The good life at present and progress in the future are what I want stressed. I love you, signed W.E.B. Dubois. Now we could argue that Schiller's text will affirm the good God, religion, etc., but for Dubois here, he's pushing things in a different direction. Now, we began with a birthday celebration today. Stevie Wonder's song for Martin Luther King Jr. will end with Dubois's funeral, but actually a second birthday as well. The song Dubois requested as his final symphonic celebratory finale of his funeral is Schiller's text, modified a bit by Beethoven as from An die Freude Note and as the Ode to Joy, better translated as the hymn of praise to happiness. This is the famous choral movement from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. I'm just going to let you hear a tiny bit of it. Here it's being sung at the Brandenburg Gate to celebrate 60 years of the German Republic in 2009. That's our second birthday with an all-star cast. Just give 1 minute or 2 to get the feel of that song. Then we'll pause for Q&A, and if it's at all possible, I'll play a little bit more after Q&A, or you can find it and listen to it yourself. It's okay. Just get an idea of that, the German music that Dubois wanted for his funeral. The German is joy, joy, where your wing waves, all people will become brothers. Here are the works cited for today. Here are my acknowledgements. Vielen Dank. Thank you to Sarah Hoppe, CSBSGU German researcher in our German program, for compiling some of the information we used today. Thank you as well to my father-in-law, a sociologist who researched Dubois in the past, Werner Lange, and who was even published in Dubois's journal Phylon. He was a very helpful interlocutor and resource for this talk and helped find some of those archival materials we shared today. You made it, all those proper names: Angela Davis, Stevie Wonder, MLK, Audre Lorde, Kant, Goethe, Schiller, Beethoven, and the H's, Hölderlin, Heidegger, Hegel, and Herder, as well as our hero of the hour, W.E.B. Du Bois himself. Thank you for your attention. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Thank you, Malik. I'll switch now to Q&A.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Hollender. And now we're going to spend a few minutes time for Q&A. So audience members, if you have a question, if you look on the bottom of your screen, there's that Q&A box. You can go ahead and type them in, and we'll make sure we get to all the audience questions. One thing that I have to say that stood out to me in this, just towards the end there, mentioning W.E.B. Du Bois's will and testament at the end of his life, was that quote of what he was thinking about, progress in the future, or what I want stressed. And I can't think of a better line to connect to our theme of the fierce urgency of now, right? That in the moment of death, this man was thinking about what needs to happen, because for some folks it will be too late. I also noted that the importance of the sort of global solidarity, right? That W.E.B. Du Bois is this, American Black intellectual who spent so much time in Germany, and how that influenced him. And I'm wondering if you could just maybe talk a little bit more about other potential African-American intellectuals who spent time in Germany, and how that global solidarity is important.
Yes, I'm very happy to. So for the first instance about the urgency of now, I mean, we could also look at a few other German intellectuals around this time that Du Bois probably studied who would have argued for Schiller, it is an Elysium that we should have now, a futural, not a Garden of Eden that we've left, but a future perfect society that we should be aiming for. So Du Bois may have been influenced there as well. Another poet, I'm not sure if Du Bois mentioned, but he comes from this time, and I'm sure he read him as well, Novalis would have argued for now. We need to change things now. So yes, you definitely feel that urgency from Du Bois. And like we mentioned from the Journal of Study Abroad, Du Bois was probably the most prominent, famous American to study abroad in the 19th century. It's quite a statement. Boy, did he know how to pick them, right? Harvard University, what becomes the Humboldt University, he works with some of the greatest thinkers of the day and stayed in touch with them. He even invited the great sociologist Max Weber to Atlanta at one point. Now, I guess it's not necessarily, it's a little sad that he didn't get his degree there because he'd done all the requirements other than this strange residency permit. Otherwise, he also would have gotten a PhD from the Humboldt University. But he mentions the Slater Fund. I don't exactly know the Slater Fund, but it's not that surprising that many Americans and many prominent African-American intellectuals have studied in Germany because there's simply a ton of money to go study abroad there. They have more money for study abroad than we do. And we send more Fulbright scholars, our State Department funding, to Germany than any other country. So their domestic money is more, and we send more people there because the universities are great, the infrastructure is great, and they can really absorb a lot of students. And frankly, they want the best. They want the next Du Bois is coming there. They're extremely proud of Du Bois. Was at the Humboldt University. You can even visit a plaque. I have an image of it somewhere. I won't be able to draw. But many other folks have gone there. Davis, Audre Lorde, who we mentioned as well. But it's very interesting that MLK himself visited at the height of his popularity on both sides of the wall. This was almost unthinkable to folks back then. And if you read some of the accounts of the East Germans too, who went to see him, for some of them it was he was like a celebrity. He signed their tickets that they kept for their lives. They referred to him. Some of them have pictures of him in their home because they could see, at least those striving for more freedom and more contact with the relatives across the borders and so on and so forth, saw in him an advocate for their plight in certain ways. And yet at the same time, both governments saw him as someone who was fighting for equality, both the capitalists and the communists. So it's very interesting that he too was one of the few folks who could go to both sides of that wall, draw a crowd, and people could hear something that was very, very interesting from him. Now, to trail, I mentioned too that the nonviolent dissolution of the East Germany may have been partly inspired by him. It would be hard to map that, but some folks of some East Germans who've given accounts of his meeting have made that connection. So that would be kind of quick answers, or long, I don't know. Sorry, I like to talk.
No, it's wonderful. I think, at St. Ben's and St. John's with, a lot of students that study abroad, the importance of global perspective and solidarity, it ties into the Beyond Vietnam sermon. It ties into this. So it's fascinating. I got a question here from the audience. Did Du Bois write any of his works in German?
That's a great, so I'm not sure if he translated any of them. He didn't, the ones that I know, the really famous ones, he did not write all in German, but there are many German quotes throughout. So if we'd had more time, you could look at the Wagner quotes in Souls of Black Folk. Schiller is one of the poets who he cites at the beginning of a chapter as well from his Maid of Orleans drama. So he tends to cite directly in German. He'll also, I believe, use some Latin terms and things like that too, but he will cite in German. And he doesn't always translate right after. He almost assumes that folks should read it. And I know that when he was at Wilberforce University in Ohio, he told his folks, learn the classics and learn German. He told his students to do so. So yeah, I don't know about a full work written in German. It's definitely some correspondence was written fully in German, but he'll cite in German.
Wonderful. Well, see if there's any last audience questions, but I'm also curious, Dr. Hollender, if you can maybe just share, in your research and experience in reading some of this history, like what stands out to you as part of, the most inspiring part?
I have to say, from Dubois's work, listening to it, I listened to it a little on audio to prep for this as a reread. It's the more poetic parts are just really moving. They're just very moving poetry, which is incredible for someone who basically had, you could say, 3 careers: academic, activist, and a master of the English language. So that and this last time I read and listened to him really stood out to me. Just the mastery of the English language and the poetic parts. The first time I read it, I was excited for all the German stuff. Like, oh yes, he's a Germanist. He's a language prof. I forgot, but I would say that. So take a look at the book. It's roughly 160 some pages. You can read it on a weekend. You can listen to an audiobook, but it's very moving. It's an amazing piece of literature.
Well, thank you. And once again, I'd like to say thank you to our guest today, Dr. Kurt Hollender, for that wonderful presentation. I have no doubt that we can take lessons, and I hope folks are Googling and seeking out more information about W.E.B. Du Bois, his time in Germany, and his influence on Dr. Martin Luther King. As a reminder, our final MLK week is happening on Thursday evening at 6:30 p.m. With our keynote speaker, Dr. Christopher Lehman. Dr. Lehman is the author of the award-winning book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State. And he's going to share some of that hidden history of slavery in Minnesota and how its influence still shapes us today. The event is virtual, free and open to the public. I hope to see you there, and have a good rest of your afternoon.